Hey everyone, welcome back to Jardev. I've just been sent this package here from 3rd Edition's publishing, and I think I've got a very good idea of what it is, but let's open it up as I try my best not to reveal my address. Been really looking forward to this. Okay, here we go. Is it going to be... Let's do it like this. I can't turn around the other way. You're going to see the back of it first. Ooh. Oh, little note there. Can you maybe guess what it is from that? Oh, it looks so good. Oh my god. Here it is. Dark Souls Beyond the Grave Part 2. I'll take a closer picture of it right now, which you can see in the video, because that is absolutely beautiful art. So if you remember, I did a review of the first Beyond the Grave edition. This is the second one, which has lore and information and history on Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. So I am so excited to read this. So yeah, I'm gonna go read this like right now pretty much, and then I will do a full review of the book. Alright, so I just finished reading the book, and obviously I am very impressed. It is such a good read. It's a very easy read as well, compared to the Metal Gear Solid book, for instance, was a bit of a slog at some points, but this was such an easy read. Probably because I'm very familiar with the games, but like even Bloodborne that I've only played through once was so easy to read about. So if you're just looking for the overall opinion, basically if you liked the first volume, Beyond the Grave Volume 1, you will absolutely love this. I liked the first volume, so I loved this book. If you like Dark Souls and Bloodborne, this book is for you. So I'm just going to go through the table of contents just to give you an idea of what's in the book, and then I'll talk about each part in a little bit more detail. So it's basically split into 3 parts. The first part is Bloodborne, the second part is Dark Souls 3, and the third part is what they call decryption, which is kind of talking about both games and the whole Souls series overall. And then the parts on Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 are both split up into 4 chapters, and they're the same for both books. So chapter 1 is creation, chapter 2 is universe, chapter 3 is themes, and chapter 4 is music. So the creation part is obviously just kind of the background of FromSoftware and how they got to working on Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. The universe is what most people want this book for, is the lore, its detailed descriptions and backgrounds on pretty much every character in both games. The chapter on themes is pretty self-explanatory, it's just common themes that pop up in both of the games. And the chapter on music is also very self-explanatory, but still extremely interesting and very well written. So funnily enough, I went into this book thinking that Dark Souls 3 is probably, lore-wise, the weakest of all the games, possibly excluding Demon's Souls. I personally think Dark Souls 2 has the best lore, but that is a pretty unpopular opinion. Dark Souls 1 definitely has better lore than Dark Souls 3, and I thought Bloodborne's story was very, very interesting. But in this book, the story of Bloodborne is 60 pages, while the story of Dark Souls 3 is 114 pages, which is insane. So reading the 110 plus pages of Dark Souls 3 lore definitely gave me a bit of a better appreciation for it, but I still do think it is the weakest of the series in terms of lore. I remember when I got the first volume of the book from 3rd Editions, I was most interested in reading the universe chapters, reading about the lore and the characters and stuff. But as I read the opening chapters, the creation chapters, I kind of found those maybe even more interesting, just because I love these games so much. So it was really, really cool to read about the history of FromSoftware and, like I said before, how they got to releasing, you know, Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and up to Bloodborne. So I really like those creation chapters. I almost wish they were a little bit longer. And you get such cool little like trivia tidbits from the creation chapters. Like, it's incredible how early development on Bloodborne started. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but you can actually find some map data from Bloodborne in the very first Dark Souls. So they were working on Bloodborne way back then. In my video on the first volume, Beyond the Grave Volume 1, I mentioned how refreshing it was that the authors weren't afraid to hold back if they thought there were some negative parts of the Dark Souls games, and that's very much the same in this one. although a lot of the negativity is towards Dark Souls 3, and there's not a lot towards Bloodborne. For example, there is no mention of how frustrating it is for players that Bloodborne was a PS4 exclusive. They just kind of gloss over the fact that it was a console exclusive, and they don't talk about how that's a bad thing at all, because exclusives are a terrible, terrible thing for consumers. I was also fairly surprised that there wasn't any condemnation for the fairly janky multiplayer of Bloodborne. Like the fact that you need consumable items to play with friends, and also do you have to pay for online, but I guess that's the same with all the other games if you're playing on console. So yeah, I was a little bit surprised that they didn't have some sort of a problem with how multiplayer worked in it compared to how it worked in all the other Dark Souls games. And I think what's most surprising for me was that there is no criticism of the fact that the game is locked at 30 FPS. I think they only mentioned that it was at 30 FPS, but they didn't have a go at it, which really surprised me. Because those are pretty much my three biggest criticisms with Bloodborne: that it's a PS4 exclusive, that the multiplayer is really weird, and it's 30 FPS. And the authors didn't kind of seem to have a problem with any of those, which was quite surprising. So I don't want to talk too much more about the universe chapter of Bloodborne, because I would definitely recommend people read this for themselves. Obviously, it's a lot easier to understand if you've played Bloodborne. When I read the chapter on Demon Souls in the first volume, I hadn't played Demon Souls at all, and it was really difficult to get through. But because I've played Bloodborne and I've watched a couple of Vati's videos on it, I was able to really, really enjoy the universe section of the Bloodborne part. Like I said, I don't want to talk too much about it, but there is a great part in it where they talk about the human desires of the Great Ones, which, if you're not familiar with the game, won't make any sense, but it's very interesting because the game spends the whole time making these Great Ones out to be basically the gods of the world, and in this book the authors identify how actually human the desires of the Great Ones actually are, and that was a fascinating part of the book for me. I also wrote down in my notes here that I thought the story of Bloodborne was a bit too short, and it was almost half the length of the Dark Souls section, so I would have liked that to be a bit longer. And finally, I've written here that I thought it was absolutely fantastic that they had a whole section for each Great One in the game, because some of the Great Ones, they're a little bit obscure, so it was really good to have a whole couple of pages for each Great One to learn a little bit more about them. Now, chapter 3 of the Bloodborne part, the themes chapter, is so good. There is a sort of mini biography of H.P. Lovecraft, because obviously Lovecraft is so integral to Bloodborne. So they actually do a great backstory to Lovecraft in here. They talk about Lovecraft's life, his writing obviously, his relationships, and it is really great to see the authors are obviously very familiar with Lovecraft, because they reference not only the very obvious Lovecraft influences, but even some of his really obscure stories that I haven't actually read as well. And this is the chapter where the lengths of the author's research really stood out to me, because not only is the backstory to Lovecraft really, really detailed, but they also, tying in some themes into Bloodborne, they quote from things like the Bible to Dracula. They cite obscure Aztec rituals that all have some kind of influence on Bloodborne. So the research is fantastic in this book. And then when we get to the music section, it becomes even more obvious how knowledgeable the authors are, because they're talking like the language of music, and they can talk so well about each song and what makes each song unique. And they talk about things I'd never even thought about when I was listening to the songs. And one more little fun fact about the music chapter, I don't want to talk too much about it because it's also worth just reading yourself, but it took 27 hours altogether to record Bloodborne's soundtrack. And that was all done with real orchestras, which is amazing. So in the first part of the Dark Souls 3 section, they mentioned that one of Miyazaki's tenets for design is to find the hidden beauty in things that may initially appear ugly. And I read that line, and I set the book down for a moment, and I just thought about that line, and I was like, that is so incredibly true. Because you can look at almost anything in the Dark Souls series, and initially it looks kind of gross. I don't know, talking like Majula or something. It's kind of very dreary, I guess. But I really think Majula looks absolutely beautiful. So I thought that one line sums up like the entire Souls series perfectly, so I loved that. It's also very interesting to note that Dark Souls 3 was originally planned to be released on the previous console generation. It was originally going to be on Xbox 360 and PS3. So just some more very interesting tidbits that you find in this book. So then we get to the massive section on the universe of Dark Souls 3. And before it even starts, it has a previously in Dark Souls section, which was so useful because obviously Dark Souls 3 relies a lot on people being familiar with Dark Souls 1. Definitely not so much Dark Souls 2. But it was really cool to get a really, really short, fast summary of the Dark Souls 1 lore. And it was at this point that I found the first spelling mistake of the book. It was 165 pages in, and that was the first spelling error, so I was pretty impressed with that. Overall, I found 3 spelling mistakes in the whole book, which obviously isn't ideal, but I have seen way worse in other books, so I'm not going to hold that against them at all, especially because it is translated from French. So, I mean, like I said, still not ideal, but won't hold it against them. And at the end of the book is really where they do not hold back on Dark Souls 3. They are not afraid to criticize Dark Souls 3 at all. There is a fantastic line where they say that Dark Souls 3 often feels like a mashup of all the previous games, and that could not be more true. There is so much fan service in that game, there's so many things carried over from Bloodborne into Dark Souls 3 that I never noticed before I'd played Bloodborne. I still consider Dark Souls 3 to be my favorite Dark Souls game because it's just so much fun to play compared to all the other ones, but it definitely has its faults, and the authors are not afraid to go into them at all. So there you go, that was my review of Dark Souls Beyond the Grave Volume 2, which covers Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3. I absolutely love this book. I think I liked it more than the previous book. Probably because, like I said, I wasn't familiar with Demon's Souls when I read it, and also I'm so familiar with Dark Souls 3, so it was really cool to read 110 plus pages about the lore of it. So to any Souls fans, I would wholeheartedly recommend this book. I absolutely loved it. Thank you guys very much for watching this video. Make sure you leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys later. Bye!